Welcome to the lecture on civil society in Africa. This is one of those lectures where the terms are a little bit loaded in the sense that even in Western society, civil society is a relatively new notion. Basically, you're looking at a correlation between the idea of civil society and the idea of modern states in a modern world state system. And for this, you're really looking back to 1648, to the Treaty of Westphalia, that ended a terrible, several decades long religious war that had swept across Europe. And what you had in trying to end this war were two salient features. The Congress of Westphalia featured the nations of Europe. They didn't want to fight anymore. Everyone was quite exhausted from the extent and the duration of the religious wars. And so the first thing that was achieved was an agreement that the international state system should no longer be regarded as religious. It was to be a secular state system. That was one thing. The other big achievement of Westphalia was the fact that when the Congress began, and it went on for quite some time, 179 European states turned up, and a very great deal of the early discussions was where the hell people were going to sit. Not just was there enough room for them to sit, but was there to be a ranking order? Was there going to be, as it were, some kind of priority for powerful states? But trying to order 179 states made everyone realize just how unwieldy the European state system had become. So the second great accomplishment of Westphalia was the beginning of a process of the agglomeration of states into larger units. A process that went on for some time, to be sure, but states that we now regard naturally as being unitary, like Germany, like Italy, were fragmented in those days, and they were part of a process of coming together, a process that has not completely ended to this day when we talk about the possibilities of the United States of Europe, for instance. In other words, you had the realization that for functional states to exist in an increasingly modern world, you had to have units of organization with critical mass. You couldn't have hundreds of little states trying to replicate state functions. That made no sense at all. And so it was at this time that we began to enter the era of what we loosely call Enlightenment thought. There was a huge breakthrough in terms of Western concepts of how to live as individuals and how to live as community organizations within large states. The community of states was something which was at stake in the discussions and in the philosophizing that began at this point in time. So you're looking at people like Immanuel Kant, for instance, and what we call cosmopolitanism, from which we derive our modern theories of individual human rights. People like Kant began writing about this kind of natural justice underneath a kind of universal schema of justice that applied to every single individual. And because it applied to every single individual as a categorical imperative of the nature of the universe, every individual had rights. The individual was rights bearing. At roughly the same time, other philosophers like Hegel began writing about communitarianism, about how society was organized on a communal basis, particularly within the new state system. So you had everywhere the ferment of how are we going to regard ourselves. Now, Hegel proposed that there were two singular categories that were obvious. One was the individual, and the other was the state, and the state had been freshly refurbished, as I said. And then you had this huge intervening space in between. You had the space that he said should be called civil society. And it was a space of socialization in two respects. First of all, as an individual, you were born into a family. Now, this needs to be stressed as being the modern nuclear family, already established in Europe by that point in time. So at one stage, you had being born into a family, and at a later adult stage, when you were no longer a child, you had citizenship of a state. Well, what happened in between? And Hegel proposed that what was in between was civil society. That is the capacity and indeed the desire and the natural desire of citizens to agglomerate themselves into units which would A, protect them against any rapaciousness on behalf of the state, able to pressurize the state, but also able to organize the community in a way which was not dependent on the state. It was very, very much, as was Kant's formulation of individual rights, a cry for the freedom of the community. So you had these kinds of twin tracks in the development of European thought that became hugely influential in the rest of the world after this point in time, the 17th and the 18th centuries onwards. Now, the problem is that at this point in time also, continents like Africa were not yet part of the international state system. And of course, the additional problem was that when they did become part of the international state system, it was due to a process in the first instance of imperial colonization, led basically by the very European states that had finally overcome, for the most part, not entirely, wars among themselves. They still went to war, but only for different reasons. The idea of going to war and not having to go to war, of course, came to a head at the Congress of Berlin in 1884, 1885, Christmas, New Year. And the proposition basically at the Congress of Berlin was that when it came to Africa, it wasn't worth going to war over. So they divided up Africa into its component parts, essentially the component parts which exist today. Today's modern state boundaries derive comprehensively from the Treaty of Berlin. But what it did do was something which replicated what had occurred in Europe. And that is, it took what I've already described to you as 2,000 different ethnic units with 2,000 different languages, and it agglomerated them into much larger modern states, modern meaning in terms of size, in terms of critical mass. Critical mass for the sake of colonial administration in the first instance, but the kind of critical mass you also need for independent administration. When you look at Africa today, it's no, as it were, wonder that larger states, particularly those who command resources, are more successful than very smaller states that basically command no resources. Nigeria and South Africa are large units. Also, of course, what you have are very large units that are essentially ungovernable because of a lack of public administrative capacity having developed over the years. Democratic Republic of Congo being a case in point. But what this meant was that no matter what the different problems of the new states of Africa, particularly when they achieved independence, what you had was the question of what did civil society mean in these new states? 54 to 55 of them, depending on how you count it. And of course, the 2,000 different units didn't go away. You still had 2,000 cultural foundations of organization, even if they had been agglomerated into state structures, which were much, much larger, sometimes in a seamless, easy fashion, sometimes not. Civil wars, for instance, in certain countries to determine the nature of the new statehood, such as in Nigeria, very shortly after independence, the Biafran succession, as it's called, from 67 onwards into 1970. All of these things were perhaps not unexpected because the whole project of state making in the first instance had been artificial. State building was a much more complicated and fraught affair. However, civil society is meant to take its place as an intermediate category within the state. And if it was difficult to build the state, it was even more difficult in so many respects to build civil society. But civil society is something which is of huge importance. Basically, it's meant to be that intervening variable between the family and the state. It is that intervening variable that prevents you from being governed maliciously because your individual human rights are given some kind of critical mass in terms of numbers in the civil society organizations into which you are able to be organized, into which you organize yourselves. But immediately key differences began to emerge between the European model and the model that was possible, even desirable, in African states. First of all, if you had an underdeveloped state, and I've pointed out very, very often in these lectures that a country like Zambia, for instance, came to independence with 99 university graduates, and basically public administration of an efficacious modern nature was impossible. There just wasn't enough educated people to run a modern state. And it meant, of course, the development, the needful development of all kinds of philosophies to guide state building. In Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, the founding leader, called his philosophy humanism. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere called his philosophy Uyujama. And the whole idea was to give an ethos to development. The problem is that when the state develops the ethos for development, it also tries to preempt the development of any alternative ethos that might be self-originated in terms of the autonomous organization on the part of citizens. So that in many states, Zambia and Tanzania being exact cases in point, what you had were the development of single-party states. And the single party occupied the space that would normally be devoted to civil society. In other words, the autonomy of citizen organization was preempted. You couldn't even choose among political parties. There was one political party, end of story. And it became not only a preemptive device, it became very, very much a hegemonic device. It had to compete, of course, with previously existing forms of social organization in terms of ethnic groupings, for instance. But these ethnic groupings themselves were formed in a different way to what you might expect if you were a European colonizer. If you're going to take Hegel's formulation that you began as a child in a family, well, what you had was the phenomenon of the extended family. To what extent did this extended family go? Is it still a powerful force today, such as a clan in Somalia, for instance? This extended family, what purpose does it serve in today's world? When you look at the work of Chappell and Delors on corruption, their book, Africa Works, what you have is basically a statement that corruption along lines of patronage, often family linked, provides the means of sharing public monies corruptly, as we might say, but sharing monies all the same that would otherwise not be able to be shared through the normal state mechanisms, because those state mechanisms are still not yet fully developed. So the first problem of the model that Hegel proposed was, what is the family? What purpose does the family serve? In terms of your acculturation into that intermediate space between family and state, even with the achievement of multi-state societies, what freedoms do you constitutionally have that allow you to be a free individual with rights against the state, the Kantian mode of individual human rights? Can they be constitutionally guaranteed? And what rights of association do you as a group of individuals have? In other words, the right to associate in forms of civil society. And do they have to be secular, as was the case in Europe, trying to move away from the model of religious organization which had marked the terrain of warfare for so long and in such a vicious way in that part of European history? But religious organization often would have been the most amenable way of trying to organize society. A, it owed loyalty to a spiritual universe and not to the state. And B, many of these were developed from pre-existing models. In other words, they were indigenous forms of civil society. How could they be incorporated into a modern schema of things when the state, rightly or wrongly, successfully or unsuccessfully, and as we know, the record is still a little mixed on these things, when the state was hell-bent on modernization? And the state was hell-bent on modernization precisely because it was the only way the state could survive in the modern world, as an interstate system. If you can't cooperate, collaborate, and coordinate your activities with those of other states, you're dead in the water in the international state system, particularly when it comes to international economic relations. And certainly during the years of the Cold War, and perhaps in the looming renewal of a form of Cold War that we're seeing developing right now, being able to have interaction with other states, even being able to take sides with one state grouping or another, is an achievement only possible if you're a modern state with those kinds of institutional linkages that allow relationships with analogous institutions in other states. But then this precisely becomes a problem for civil society, because in the West, you've got the development of a huge civil society apparatus, a huge civil society organization, many of which concern precisely with citizen rights, human rights, Amnesty International being a case in point, for instance, forms of rights to development, development aid, development assistance, Oxfam being a case in point. Do they come with certain values which are then transmitted, perhaps even imposed upon their counterparts in emerging countries, not just in Africa, but in Asia and other parts of the world? In other words, to what extent, whatever very good reasons that appear to be there on the surface, and I certainly think that individual human rights is a very good reason for communication among groups around the world, but to what extent does the particularity of the approach to human rights inflect itself upon local civil society, also very much concerned with human rights, but wishing to arrive at a concept of human rights in a slightly different way? I have a PhD student from Botswana right now. She just won an international prize in international human rights. She, in Botswana, is heading up one of those very rare African civil society organizations concerned not only with human rights, but the human rights of people of different genders, that's male and female and anything else, trans, for instance, the human rights of people who are gay, who are lesbian, plus, plus, plus. And this is very, very much in terms of an ethos of tolerance in Swana society. Reflects also the constitutional provision that was made in neighboring South Africa at the time of the end of apartheid, when equalities were given across the board, not just to black and white, but basically to any grouping that existed in South Africa, provided it was not a grouping that was designed to exploit people. In other words, the whole idea of equality is to prevent exploitation. So you have, as it were, in that part of the continent, this drive towards these kinds of equalities. based very, very much on the rights of civil society, organized groups to protect these rights, and the right of these civil society organizations to liaise with their counterparts outside. But must they absorb the values precisely of those organizations outside, particularly when those organizations outside are sponsoring organizations? In other words, the whole problematic idea of receiving foreign aid, of receiving financial assistance, of receiving mentorship from international non-governmental organizations, does this reflect upon and change the values of local civil society, local non-governmental organizations? And the fascinating aspect of the work of my PhD student in Botswana is her discourse on alternative philosophical ways of enunciating rights, of enunciating concepts to do with tolerance, and enunciating concepts to do with communal organization, and where these stand in the face of anything that we might once have called and now might call a state. Now, this is an extremely worthy project. It runs into an immediate problem, of course, in that the whole idea of rights, individual or communal, in Europe was able to be written down and debated. We still debate Kant and Hegel to this very day. You can spend your entire lifetime in academia basically doing nothing but Kant and Hegel. And a lot of people do spend their lifetimes doing exactly this, often not very well, I hasten to add, but it's the flavor of debate. Can't really think of two more influential philosophers in the modern era than these two who lived more than 200 years ago. Doesn't have to be Kant and Hegel, but we are able to debate them because they were written down. The text is able to be interrogated. The written discourse that followed them is able to be interrogated by both verbal, spoken, and written means. Academia could not exist without the written medium, for instance. So where does this place oral values? Values that were developed in a system of communication that did not rely upon writing. Does this have any validity? Can this be the subject of what Kwame Gyekye, the Ghanaian philosopher working at Harvard and Princeton, what he called sagely wisdom? And can sagely wisdom be as complex as Kantian and Hegelian wisdom? Can knowledge be appropriated to represent the universe and its values in simplistic form? Or is there an indigenous expressionism which is just as complex as anything else in the world, but which is often not appreciated by the outside world? And particularly if it's beginning to be appreciated in terms of local societies, in terms of local civic and civil organizations, for instance, in what way can these values be understood and transmitted into a realm of understanding to outside groups? And since the outside groups often provide funding, establishing very often an unequal relationship, and this funding is derived from donations from the public at large in Western countries, to what extent can questions of rights as enunciated in the languages of Botswana be brought home to be something meaningful to those who donate to Amnesty International, to Oxfam, etc., etc.? So you have a global problem in which African civil society participates. Certainly, I think the first step is you've got to accommodate religious civil organizations in civil society. It's been very often the church, either Christian or indigenous, that has proposed values in the face of dictatorship. And certainly in terms of Catholic organizations, being able to derive support from the Vatican in Rome has meant a degree of protection in terms of their protests against government. There's been cases in point in that. In Angola, for instance. Without Vatican validation, what you would have had in Angola underneath the Dos Santos regime would have been a persecution of the churches who, at one point in time, were the only organizations able, brave enough, to stand up against great authoritarianism. So religious organizations have got to be able to participate in that intervening space between citizen and state. The normal organizations like labor organizations, press organizations, all of these things, of course, come into play and are problematic in terms, for instance, of press freedom, in terms of the capacity to be able to go on strike. Right now, as we speak, in Zimbabwe, tens of thousands of teachers have been fired, or at least placed under suspension. Many of them won't come back because they wanted to exercise the right to go on strike because of the need for better salaries so they and their families could survive in a deteriorating national economy. The response was not to engage with them by the government in dialogue, but simply to suspend them. They tried the same thing with the communities, the trade unions of doctors and nurses at an earlier stage in the meltdown in Zimbabwe. So are these organizations able to stand, even if they represent just cause, which can be expressed either indigenously or just cause in terms of the services that they provide to the nation and the state as a whole? And the accusation that they are simply stooges of outside powers is something which is often used as a means of curtailing their activities or trying to discredit their activities. Of course, the Zimbabwean government would say that precisely because of the economic meltdown, there's a certain condition of emergency in the country. No matter who caused it, and the jury is still very much out on that, basically there is a justification, quote unquote, for a certain authoritarianism, a moment of emergency. But what you have very, very much, therefore, in these moments of emergency is what are the limits of protest, the limits of self-organization, and the limits of being able to contribute new ideas to the ending of that condition of emergency. And this is even possible when, outside of economic emergency, what you have in many parts of Africa still, and certainly at some key points to a very, very vexed and major extent, you have conditions of warfare. Can any kind of organization exist? Or do new forms of organization arise? Jan Patočka, the famous Czech dissident philosopher, at the time when what was then called the Republic of Czechoslovakia was trying to achieve an independence from the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, shades of Ukraine today, when Jan Patočka said what you had really underneath conditions of war and the threat of war was the solidarity of the shaken. This is a very, very resonant statement to me. Can the shaken, can those who are in turmoil organize themselves in a meaningful way that makes a lasting contribution to the future of society? Or underneath the conditions of the shaken, do the organizations that emerge at that point in time provide the only meaningful ways into the future? Because don't forget, it was precisely after the religious wars of Europe that new forms of civil organization began to be developed in Europe to take Europe into the future. Perhaps they weren't understood at that point in time, just as many organized ways of looking at Africa are not fully understood at this moment in time. So what we have is a moment of ferment. And I think this moment of ferment has been going on for quite some time, particularly in countries struggling to achieve some kind of unity after civil war, such as in Nigeria, for instance. It explains the tenor of great novels by authors in Nigeria, such as Wole Soyinka, The Interpreters, a novel about young people just emerging, just graduating from university, setting about their world. and realizing that they're about to enter, as educated people, a world of disjunctures. And this is a world not only of disjunctures in terms of political expectation and social organization, there's a world of disjunctures in terms of psychological adjustment to something that was not fully organized and not fully wanting at that point in time because of not being fully able to be organized. So the idea of civil society has got to encompass not only a desirable form of citizen organization, but a desirable form underneath conditions of emergency, under conditions of development, including psychological development, bringing, as it were, a whole new complexity to the way that we view civil society. Perhaps something, this whole condition of trauma, being able to be reflected only in the work of novelists. People like Soyinka in Nigeria, people like Yvonne Vera in Zimbabwe, for instance. And the whole idea of reconciliation, of bringing a divided citizen body into one united citizen body, the stuff of hugely heroic efforts at transitional justice, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. All of these things bespeak an Africa that is actually showing amazing signs of organization and of trying to express and to put forward into both the national and the international frames new values for organization, new values of organization, new values that are meaningful to the foundations of the emerging state, new values propagated in the first instance by civil society. Because without that kind of buy-in, without that kind of origination from the mass of the people, something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would have been impossible. It wasn't just Desmond Tutu's idea. He had to reflect, as it were, an ethos that he could identify as being at large. This returns, of course, and he would have said, to the whole concept of Ubuntu, something still very hazy because not written, something, however, being made more complex and able to be interrogated, but already something which is being used often as some kind of greetings card philosophy, but capable of being developed into a modern form of ethos, a modern set of ethics, capable of guiding society and acting as a foundation to guide the state and possibly impact upon international relations. So from the solidarity of the shaken, and certainly South Africa was shaken by the years of apartheid and the huge efforts, not yet fully accomplished, to emerge from the after effects of apartheid, what we may yet have is a template to set alongside other templates in the world, and a quality of Africa in the world, not only in the terms of civic organization, but in terms of the values of civic and civil organization. Hegel wrote about a spirit of history. It's very, very strange how Kant and Hegel, although being part of a huge movement and being champions of a huge movement to escape from religious dogma, religious imposition, nevertheless used spiritual images. Hegel spoke of a spirit of history. It was almost reminiscent of the Holy Spirit of God. Kant spoke of a universal justice, as if that was something a priori, something that had always existed, something like God's mercy that shines upon everyone. The use of spiritual imagery was very, very much apparent in terms of their writings for a new secular age. Some kind of combination, a knowing combination of secular and indigenous spiritual thought may yet have a mark to make as African thought emerges into a manner of integration, incorporation, and influence upon the modern stage. In the meantime, the efforts of governments, of states to suppress civil society becomes also an effort to suppress precisely the possibility of this kind of indigenous representation of the self. and acts against the emergence of the state as a mature entity with mature organizations within it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've tried to be provocative here. I've tried to say something that is, let us say, not fully expressed in a lot of the debate, and certainly something which is not usually expressed by even very, very well-meaning Western non-governmental organizations that claim to represent not only civil society, but the values of civil society. What you've got is the possibility of state building, citizen participation via means of citizen rights and citizen organization, and the possibilities of building a multiverse within a state, trying to bring together a united plurality. In other words, the state becomes just as diverse in terms of those units that debate as was once diverse in terms of its many, many ethnic groups. But a new form of diversity, a new form of pluralism, a new form of freedom, tolerance, individual, communal rights. Basically, civil society is the thought of a new form of state. Thank you very much.